On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the United States Pacific Fleet lay peacefully at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 196 ships were in port that Sunday, including 8 massive battleships moored along what the sailors called Battleship Row. The morning was warm and clear, the kind of perfect Hawaiian day that made service in the Pacific seem like a blessing rather than a duty. Church services were scheduled for that morning. Sailors were sleeping in after Saturday night liberty. Families in the nearby neighborhoods were preparing breakfast. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But 180 miles to the north, 353 Japanese aircraft were preparing to shatter that peace forever. It was exactly 6:48 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, when 2 young Army privates stared at their radar screen in complete disbelief. Private Joseph Lockhart and Private George Elliott were stationed at Opana Point, a remote mobile radar station perched on the northern tip of Oahu, Hawaii. What they saw on that primitive oscilloscope would haunt them for the rest of their lives. A massive blip, the largest either of them had ever seen. Lockhart turned to Elliott, his voice barely above a whisper. "George, are you seeing this? This can't be right." Elliott leaned closer to the screen, his eyes widening. That's not a malfunction. That's real. Joe, that looks like more than 50 aircraft. What these 2 young men had detected was actually 183 Japanese warplanes screaming toward Pearl Harbor at over 200 miles per hour. They were the first Americans to see the attack coming. They tried to warn their superiors. They called the information center at Fort Shafter. And what happened next would change the course of history. The officer who answered that call laughed. He told them not to worry about it. And within 90 minutes, 4 American battleships would be resting on the bottom of Pearl Harbor. 2,403 Americans would be dead, and the United States would be thrust into the deadliest conflict in human history. This is the true story of the warning that was ignored, the men who tried to save their country, and the catastrophic price of one officer's fatal miscalculation. If you find this story moving, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful, true stories to life. To understand how such a catastrophic failure could occur, we need to go back several months before that fateful Sunday morning. The relationship between the United States and Japan had been deteriorating for years. Japan's aggressive expansion throughout Asia, its invasion of China, and its alliance with Nazi Germany had created a powder keg of tension in the Pacific. In July of 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt had frozen all Japanese assets in the United States and imposed an oil embargo. For Japan, a nation almost entirely dependent on imported oil, this was an existential threat. Their military machine would grind to a halt within 18 months unless they could secure new oil supplies. The Japanese High Command saw only 2 options: submit to American demands and withdraw from China, which they considered unthinkable, or strike a devastating blow against the American Pacific Fleet and seize the oil-rich Dutch East Indies while America was still reeling. They chose war. The planning for the Pearl Harbor attack began in January of 1941, when Admiral Yamamoto first proposed the idea to the Japanese Naval General Staff. Many senior officers thought the plan was insane. Pearl Harbor was nearly 4,000 miles from Japan, the deepest naval raid ever attempted. The chances of detection seemed enormous. The risks were almost incalculable. But Yamamoto was persistent. He argued that the only hope for Japan in a Pacific war was to eliminate American naval power in a single devastating strike. Half measures would accomplish nothing. If Japan was going to fight America, it had to fight with everything it had, all at once, before the Americans could mobilize their overwhelming industrial strength. By September, the plan was approved. By November, a fleet of 33 ships, including 6 aircraft carriers, had sailed from Japan under strict radio silence. They took a northern route through stormy seas, where merchant traffic was rare and the chances of detection were minimal. For 11 days, they crept across the Pacific, moving closer to their target, preparing for an attack that would change the world. The pilots who would carry out the attack had trained for months in conditions designed to simulate Pearl Harbor. They practiced shallow water torpedo runs, learning to release their weapons at exactly the right altitude and speed to ensure the torpedoes wouldn't dive too deep in the harbor's shallow waters. They studied scale models of the American base, memorizing the positions of the battleships, the locations of the fuel tanks, the layout of the airfields. They knew exactly what they were going to do, and they were very, very good at it. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, had spent years in the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than almost anyone in Japan. He knew that in a prolonged war, Japan could not win. But he also believed that if Japan could destroy the American fleet in a single devastating surprise attack, they might force the United States to negotiate a peace settlement. It was a desperate gamble, and it would fail catastrophically. But on that December morning, none of that mattered to the young men watching their radar screens. The Opana Point radar station was nothing impressive to look at. It was a mobile unit mounted on a truck, positioned on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The SCR-270 radar was primitive by modern standards, with a range of roughly 150 miles and limited ability to determine altitude or precise numbers of aircraft. But it worked, and on that morning, it worked perfectly. The station had been operational since November, part of a network of 6 radar sites designed to provide early warning of any air attack on Oahu. But the system was still being integrated into the military command structure, and there were constant problems. Communication lines were unreliable. Training was incomplete. Many officers didn't understand what radar could and couldn't do. Private Joseph Lockard was 20 years old, a farm boy from Pennsylvania who had joined the Army Signal Corps because he was fascinated by radio technology. He had been trained on the new SCR-270 radar system, one of only 6 mobile radar units deployed in Hawaii. The technology was so new that most officers didn't understand what it could do. Lockard was good at his job, really good. He could read the oscilloscope better than anyone else in his unit. He understood the patterns, knew how to distinguish between different types of aircraft, could estimate distances and directions with remarkable accuracy for someone so young. That Sunday morning, he and Private George Elliott had been on duty since 4 in the morning. Their shift was supposed to end at 7, but the truck that was supposed to pick them up and take them to breakfast hadn't arrived yet, so they kept watching the screen. Elliott was even newer to radar than Lockard. He had only been practicing for a few weeks, and Lockard had been showing him the ropes. When the massive blip appeared at 6:48, Elliott thought he might be making a mistake. "Joe, I think something's wrong with the equipment," Elliott said, tapping the screen. Lockard moved closer, studying the oscilloscope with practiced eyes. His heart began to race. "No, George, the equipment's fine. That's a formation, a big one, coming from the north." He began calculating. The blip was approximately 136 miles away, bearing 3 degrees east of north. Based on the size of the return signal, he estimated at least 50 aircraft, possibly more. The formation was moving fast, heading directly toward Oahu. "We need to report this," Lockard said, reaching for the telephone. The telephone line connected Opana Point to the information center at Fort Shafter, about 30 miles away. The center was supposed to be the nerve center of Oahu's air defense system, the place where all radar reports would be compiled, analyzed, and used to direct intercepting fighters. In theory, it was a sophisticated operation. In practice, it was still a work in progress. The information center operated on a limited schedule, from 4 in the morning until 7 in the morning each day. Those hours had been chosen because military planners believed that any attack was most likely to come at dawn, when attacking aircraft would have the advantage of approaching from the direction of the rising sun. After 7 o'clock, the plotting board was shut down and most of the staff went to breakfast. On this particular morning, the timing would prove catastrophic. This was exactly the situation the radar system had been designed to detect. For months, military commanders in Hawaii had been worried about the possibility of a Japanese attack. The radar stations had been set up specifically to provide early warning, and now, for the first time, that early warning system was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Lockard called the information center at Fort Shafter, the facility responsible for coordinating all radar reports in Hawaii. The phone rang several times before someone answered. On the other end was Private Joseph McDonald, a switchboard operator who had just watched most of the plotting staff leave for breakfast. The information center was supposed to be fully staffed until 8 in the morning, but it was Sunday. Most of the officers had already left for church or breakfast. The only officer remaining was Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, a young pilot who was serving as the pursuit officer that morning. It was only his second day on the job. Tyler had arrived at the information center at 4 that morning, relieving the night duty officer. He had received minimal briefing about what to expect, or how to respond to various situations. He knew almost nothing about the radar system's capabilities or limitations. He had no intelligence briefings about Japanese movements or intentions. He was, in every meaningful sense, flying blind. What Tyler did know was that tensions with Japan were high. He had heard rumors about war warnings being sent to commanders throughout the Pacific. He knew that something was brewing, but like most junior officers, he assumed that the senior leadership had everything under control. The information center that morning was nearly empty. The plotting board had been shut down at 7 o'clock, and most of the enlisted men who operated it had gone to breakfast. Tyler was essentially alone, waiting for his relief to arrive, trying to stay awake after a night of little sleep. McDonald listened as Lockard described what he was seeing. "Hold on," McDonald said. "Let me get the lieutenant." Tyler picked up the phone. He was 28 years old, a fighter pilot from the 14th Pursuit Wing. He had volunteered for this duty assignment because he wanted to learn more about the new radar technology. But his training had been minimal. He had never dealt with an actual radar contact before. "Lieutenant Tyler speaking," he said. Lockard's voice was urgent. "Sir, we've got a large formation of aircraft coming in from the north, bearing 3 degrees east of north, distance 136 miles. It's the largest group I've ever seen on the screen." Tyler listened, trying to process what he was hearing. A large formation of aircraft approaching from the north. His mind immediately went to the most logical explanation. Just the day before, Tyler had been at dinner with a bomber pilot friend who had mentioned that a flight of B-17 Flying Fortress bombers was scheduled to arrive from California sometime on Sunday morning. The bombers would be coming from the mainland, flying in from the northeast. To navigate across the vast Pacific, the pilots often tuned their radio direction finders to Hawaiian radio stations, particularly KGMB, which broadcast Hawaiian music through the night, specifically to help the incoming bombers find the islands. Tyler also knew that the radio station had been playing music all night. He had heard it himself on his drive to the information center. That meant bombers must be coming in. A large formation. Coming from the north. It had to be the B-17s. What Tyler didn't know was that the B-17 flight consisted of only 12 aircraft, a fraction of the size of the formation Lockard was tracking. What he also didn't know was that the B-17s were approaching from the northeast, while the radar contact was coming from due north, a significant difference in bearing that an experienced operator would have recognized immediately. But Tyler had no experience. He had received no training on interpreting radar data. He had been given no information about how to distinguish between friendly and potentially hostile contacts. He was doing the best he could with what he had, and what he had was almost nothing. The tragic irony is that those 12 B-17 bombers arrived over Oahu just as the attack was beginning. Their pilots, exhausted after a 14-hour flight from California, flew straight into the chaos. Japanese fighters attacked them. American anti-aircraft gunners, unable to distinguish between friend and foe in the confusion, fired on them. Several of the bombers were damaged, and their crews were forced to make emergency landings at any airfield they could find. One B-17 landed on a golf course. Another set down on a road near a sugarcane field. It was a miracle that any of them survived. "Don't worry about it," Tyler said casually. Lockard couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Sir, this is a very large formation. I've never seen anything like it." Tyler almost laughed. The young private sounded so worried. "Forget it," he said. "It's nothing." And with that, he hung up the phone. Lockard stared at the receiver in his hand, stunned. Elliot looked at him expectantly. "What did they say?" "He said to forget it. Said it's nothing." The two privates looked at each other, then back at the screen. The blip was growing larger, closer. Whatever was coming, it was still coming. "Should we call back?" Elliot asked. Lockard hesitated. He was just a private. Tyler was an officer. In the military, you followed orders. If the lieutenant said to forget it, you forgot it. That was how things worked. But something felt wrong, very wrong. "Let's keep tracking it," Lockard said, "just in case." They continued watching as the formation grew closer. 7 o'clock passed. 7:10, 7:15. The blip was now less than 30 miles away. Then something strange happened, and the signal began to break up, scattering into interference from the surrounding mountains. At 7:39, they lost the contact entirely. What Lockard and Elliot didn't know was that the formation had dropped to low altitude, using the valleys between Oahu's mountains to mask their approach. The Japanese pilots had trained for months for exactly this moment. They knew the terrain. They knew where the American ships were anchored. They knew exactly how to approach without being seen. In the cockpits of those approaching aircraft, Japanese pilots were making their final preparations. They had been briefed exhaustively on their targets. Each pilot knew exactly which ship, which hangar, which fuel tank he was supposed to attack. They had memorized approach routes and escape vectors. They had practiced their attacks so many times that they could execute them almost automatically. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, in the lead aircraft, felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. This was the moment everything had been building toward. If the attack succeeded, Japan would control the Pacific. If it failed, Japan might face destruction. He looked down at the clouds below him, then at his compass, then at his watch. They were exactly on schedule. Everything was proceeding according to plan. At 7:45, the clouds parted and Fuchida saw Oahu spread out beneath him. The harbor was there, just where it was supposed to be. And lined up along the shore, exactly as intelligence had predicted, were the battleships of the American Pacific Fleet. At 7:48, the first bombs began to fall. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the leader of the first wave of Japanese aircraft, looked down at Battleship Row and saw something that made his heart soar. The American fleet was lined up perfectly, 8 battleships moored side by side along Ford Island. There was no sign of alarm, no anti-aircraft fire, no American fighters rising to meet them. Complete surprise. Fuchida gave the order to attack, then transmitted the code phrase that would be heard throughout the Japanese fleet. "Tora, Tora, Tora," Tiger. The code word meaning that complete surprise had been achieved. Below him, the peaceful Sunday morning exploded into chaos. The first torpedo bombers swept in low over the harbor, their deadly payloads splashing into the water and racing toward the moored battleships. The USS Oklahoma was hit first, taking multiple torpedo strikes along her port side. The massive ship began listing almost immediately. Lieutenant Commander Samuel Fuqua was the damage control officer aboard the USS Arizona, one of the largest and most powerful battleships in the Pacific Fleet. He was just sitting down to breakfast when the first explosions rocked the ship. "General quarters," someone shouted, "and we're under attack." Fuqua raced to his battle station, but he had barely made it to the deck when a Japanese bomb penetrated the Arizona's forward magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. Over 1 million pounds of gunpowder detonated in an instant, creating a fireball that rose over 1,000 feet into the air. The force of the blast killed over 1,000 men in seconds. The Arizona's entire forward section was destroyed, and the ship began sinking immediately. Fuqua was thrown across the deck, knocked unconscious by the concussion. When he came to, he found himself surrounded by fire and dying men. Despite his injuries, Fuqua organized rescue efforts, pulling wounded sailors from the flames and directing firefighting operations. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that morning. But there was nothing he or anyone else could do to save the Arizona. Within 9 minutes of the explosion, she had settled on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, taking 1,177 of her crew with her. To this day, the exact cause of the Arizona's catastrophic explosion is debated. The most likely explanation is that a single 1,600-pound armor-piercing bomb, dropped from high altitude by a Japanese bomber, penetrated the ship's deck and detonated near the forward magazine. The resulting explosion was so powerful that it created a shockwave that knocked men off their feet on ships hundreds of yards away. Ensign Jim Miller was aboard the USS Tennessee, moored just behind the Arizona. He was shaving in his cabin when the explosion occurred. The force of the blast threw him against the wall, shattering the mirror above his sink. When he reached the deck, he saw something he would never forget: a wall of flame where the Arizona had been and debris raining down from the sky. "I saw pieces of the ship falling everywhere," Miller later recalled. "Steel, wood, paper, bodies. The air was full of it, and the heat. Even from our deck, I could feel the heat from that fire." Across the harbor, the nightmare was unfolding everywhere. The USS Oklahoma, struck by multiple torpedoes, capsized completely, trapping over 400 men inside her hull. Some would survive for days in air pockets, tapping on the hull, hoping someone would hear them. Rescue crews worked frantically to cut through the thick steel, but for most of the trapped men, help came too late. The USS West Virginia was hit by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Captain Mervyn Bennion was mortally wounded by shrapnel early in the attack, but he refused to be moved from his command post until he lost consciousness. He died later that morning. Doris Miller, a mess attendant aboard the West Virginia, would become one of the first heroes of the day. Miller had been collecting laundry when the attack began. With no formal weapons training, he raced to the deck and helped move the wounded captain to safety. Then he manned an unmanned anti-aircraft gun and began firing at the Japanese planes. Miller had never been trained on the weapon. African-American sailors at that time were restricted to service roles and were not given combat training. But that morning he taught himself to shoot while Japanese aircraft screamed overhead, continuing to fire until he ran out of ammunition and was ordered to abandon ship. He would later become the first African-American to receive the Navy Cross for Valor. Throughout the harbor, ordinary men were performing extraordinary acts of courage. On the USS Vestal, a repair ship moored alongside the Arizona, Commander Cassin Young had been blown overboard by the explosion that destroyed the Arizona. Despite the chaos, despite the flames spreading across the water, he swam back to his ships, climbed aboard, and took command. He organized firefighting efforts and eventually managed to get the Vestal underway, moving her away from the burning Arizona to safer waters. Young would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that morning. Less than a year later, he would be killed in action at the naval battle of Guadalcanal, still leading from the front. On Ford Island, at the center of the harbor, sailors from the Naval Air Station were fighting to save their aircraft. Most of the planes had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, caught on the ground before they could take off. But a handful of men managed to get their weapons and began firing at the low-flying Japanese planes. Aviation machinist's mate. Third class, Julio de Castro was one of them. He pulled a machine gun from a wrecked aircraft and set it up on the flight line. For the next 2 hours, he fired at every Japanese plane that came within range, burning through thousands of rounds of ammunition. "I didn't think about anything except shooting back," de Castro later said. "My friends were dying all around me. I just wanted to hit something." Back at Opana Point, Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott heard the distant thunder of explosions. They looked at each other, a horrible realization dawning. "Oh my God," Elliott whispered. "It wasn't the B-17s." Lockhart felt sick. They had seen the attack coming, they had reported it, and they had been told to forget it. "We have to get down there," he said. "We have to help." They abandoned their radar station and raced toward Pearl Harbor, not knowing what they would find, not knowing if they could do anything, knowing only that they had tried to warn everyone and no one had listened. The scene that greeted them was beyond anything they could have imagined. Battleship Row was an inferno. Thick black smoke billowed into the sky, blocking out the morning sun. The water of the harbor was covered with burning oil, and men were swimming through flames, their screams echoing across the water. The USS California, struck by 2 torpedoes and a bomb, was slowly settling into the mud. Her crew was fighting desperately to save her, but counterflooding efforts were hampered by watertight doors that had been left open for an inspection scheduled for that morning. The USS Nevada, the only battleship that managed to get underway during the attack, was making a desperate run for the open sea. Her crew had been at morning colors when the attack began, and the ship's band had actually continued playing the Star-Spangled Banner while bombs fell around them. Now she was fighting her way toward the harbor entrance, guns blazing at any Japanese plane that came within range. But the Japanese pilot saw her moving and recognized the danger. If the Nevada could be sunk in the narrow channel leading to the sea, she would block the entire harbor, trapping every ship inside. Wave after wave of bombers concentrated on her, scoring multiple hits. With flames spreading and flooding increasing, the Nevada's captain made the agonizing decision to beach the ship rather than risk blocking the channel. She ran aground at Hospital Point, still fighting, still firing at the enemy. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler watched the destruction from the information center, his face ashen. The full weight of what had happened was beginning to crush him. The radar contact had been real, the formation had been Japanese, and he had told them to forget it. He would later testify at multiple investigations, explaining his reasoning, defending his decision. He had made what seemed like a logical assumption based on the information available to him. He knew about the incoming B-17s. He knew the radio station had been broadcasting to guide them in. A large formation from the northeast had seemed like a reasonable match. But logic and good intentions didn't matter anymore. The ships were burning. The men were dying. And the warning that might have saved them had been dismissed with a laugh. The attack came in two waves. The first wave, 183 aircraft, struck at 7:48 and concentrated on the battleships and airfields. The second wave, 171 aircraft, arrived at 8:54 and continued the devastation. American resistance, though initially scattered, grew increasingly fierce as the attack progressed. Anti-aircraft gunners who survived the initial assault manned their weapons and began taking a toll on the Japanese planes. Pilots, who managed to get their aircraft into the air, engaged the enemy with desperate courage. Second Lieutenant George Welch and Second Lieutenant Kenneth Taylor were two young Army pilots who had been playing poker all night at a hotel near Wheeler Field. When the attack began, they raced to a small auxiliary airfield at Halewa, where their P-40 fighters were stationed. Despite having no sleep, despite having no orders, despite the chaos erupting all around them, they took off and climbed into the sky to face over 350 enemy aircraft. Between them, they shot down at least 6 Japanese planes, becoming 2 of the first American heroes of the war. Welch was so aggressive that he flew into the midst of a Japanese formation attacking Iwo Field, shooting down multiple aircraft while taking hits to his own plane. When he landed to refuel and rearm, a ground crew member warned him that Japanese fighters were strafing the field. "I know," Welch replied. "I just came from up there." Then he took off again. Welch would survive the war and eventually become a test pilot, flying experimental jets for North American aviation. He remained in aviation for the rest of his career, pushing the boundaries of what aircraft could do. But he never forgot that December morning when he and Taylor were 2 of the first Americans to fight back. At Hickam Field, the Army's main air base adjacent to Pearl Harbor, the devastation was almost as severe as at the harbor itself. Rows of bombers and fighters had been lined up wingtip to wingtip, arranged that way to protect against sabotage. The arrangement made them perfect targets for Japanese strafers. Within minutes, over half of the aircraft at Hickam had been destroyed or damaged. Hangars were burning. The base chapel took a direct hit during morning services. Men who had been peacefully attending mass moments before were now fighting fires and pulling wounded comrades from the wreckage. Chief Warrant Officer William Ellis was in charge of the armament section at Hickam. When the attack began, he organized his men into firefighting and rescue teams. He personally pulled several wounded men from burning buildings and helped establish a casualty collection point. When Japanese planes returned for a second strafing run, he stood in the open, firing a pistol at them because there was nothing else available. "It was the only weapon I had," Ellis later explained. "I knew I probably couldn't hit anything, but I wasn't going to just stand there and let them shoot at my men without shooting back." By the time the second wave departed at 9:45, the damage was almost incomprehensible. 4 battleships had been sunk: the Arizona, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, and the California. 4 more were damaged. 188 American aircraft had been destroyed, most of them on the ground. 2,403 Americans were dead, and 1,178 more were wounded. The Japanese had lost only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. Fewer than 100 of their men had died. It was, by any measure, a catastrophic defeat for the United States. The nation was stunned. Americans gathered around radios, listening in disbelief as the reports came in. Newspapers printed special editions. Churches filled with people seeking comfort and understanding. Families waited desperately for news of their loved ones, stationed in Hawaii. The casualty lists took days to compile and even longer to release. Telegrams began arriving at homes across America, bringing the news that every family dreaded. In some small towns, multiple families received those terrible notifications on the same day. The impact was devastating and deeply personal. In the days after the attack, recruitment offices across the country were overwhelmed. Young men who had been uncertain about the war suddenly had no doubts. They stood in lines that stretched around city blocks, waiting for their chance to enlist. Many lied about their age to get in. Some were rejected for health reasons and tried again at different offices, determined to serve. The national mood shifted from shock to anger to steely determination. The country that had been divided over whether to join the war was suddenly united in its resolve to win it. Pearl Harbor had awakened what Admiral Yamamoto had feared most, the sleeping giant of American industrial and military power. But it was also a catastrophic miscalculation by Japan. Admiral Yamamoto had hoped to destroy not just the battleships, but the American aircraft carriers that were the real future of naval warfare. But all 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were away from Pearl Harbor that morning, safely at sea. The Enterprise was returning from Wake Island. The Lexington was delivering aircraft to Midway. The Saratoga was in San Diego for repairs. These 3 carriers would form the core of America's response, leading the Doolittle raid on Tokyo just 4 months later and turning the tide at the Battle of Midway 6 months after that. Yamamoto had also hoped to destroy Pearl Harbor's repair facilities, fuel storage tanks, and submarine base, but the Japanese attack plan focused almost entirely on the ships in the harbor, leaving the infrastructure largely intact. Within weeks, Pearl Harbor was operational again. Within months, several of the damaged battleships had been refloated and returned to service. And, perhaps most importantly of all, Yamamoto had hoped that the shock of the attack would break American morale and force the United States to seek a negotiated peace. Instead, it united a divided nation in fury and determination. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, delivering one of the most famous speeches in American history. He called December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, and asked Congress to declare war on Japan. The declaration passed with only 1 dissenting vote. In the weeks that followed, enlistment offices across America were overwhelmed with volunteers. Young men who had been undecided about the war suddenly knew exactly where they stood. The attack that was supposed to keep America out of the Pacific War had instead guaranteed that America would fight until victory was complete. But on that December morning, none of that was known. What was known was grief and rage, and the terrible question that would haunt so many people for so long. Could it have been prevented? Joseph Lockard struggled with that question for the rest of his life. He and George Eliot had done everything right. They had seen the attack coming. They had reported it immediately. They had even argued with their superior, trying to convince him that this was something serious. And they had been ignored. Lockard was never blamed for what happened. Neither was Eliot. Both men were recognized for their excellent work that morning and were praised for their professionalism. Lockard was later commissioned as an officer and served with distinction throughout the war. He became an expert on radar technology and helped train hundreds of other operators. But he never forgot those 45 minutes when he watched death approaching on his radar screen, unable to make anyone understand what was coming. Lieutenant Kermit Tyler's fate was more complicated. He was initially investigated and criticized for his response, but multiple review boards eventually concluded that he could not reasonably have been expected to make a different decision given his training and the information available to him. The fault, they determined, lay not with Tyler, but with the system. The radar warning network was new and poorly integrated into the military command structure. Tyler had received almost no training on how to evaluate radar contacts. He had no way to know that the incoming B-17 flight consisted of only 12 aircraft, far too few to produce the massive radar return that Lockard had reported. He had no access to intelligence about Japanese capabilities or intentions. In short, he had been put in an impossible position and had made a reasonable but tragically wrong decision. Tyler continued serving in the Army Air Forces throughout the war, flying combat missions in North Africa and Europe. He was awarded the Air Medal for his service and was mentioned in dispatches for his courage under fire. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1961 and lived quietly in San Diego until his death in 2010 at the age of 96. He rarely spoke publicly about what happened that morning, but those who knew him said he never stopped thinking about it. In interviews late in his life, Tyler was reflective but not defensive. He acknowledged that the outcome had been catastrophic, but he also pointed out that no one else that morning had done anything differently. None of the radar contacts from other stations had been followed up. No one had questioned the decision to shut down the plotting board at 7 o'clock. No one had thought to verify whether the incoming B-17s had actually arrived. It was part of a system that failed, Tyler said in one interview. I made a decision that was wrong, but I wasn't the only one who made mistakes that day. The whole system was broken. The truth is that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not caused by any single failure, but by dozens of them, small and large, that accumulated until catastrophe became inevitable. Intelligence agencies had intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications, suggesting that an attack was imminent, but had failed to share that intelligence with military commanders in Hawaii. The Army and Navy had failed to coordinate their defensive preparations, each assuming the other was handling certain responsibilities. Military leaders in Washington had sent war warnings to Hawaii, but had not provided specific information about the nature or timing of the expected Japanese attack. The radar warning system, which could have provided crucial early warning, was not fully integrated into the defensive plan. And on that Sunday morning, the one officer who received the radar report made a reasonable but fatal assumption that cost 2,403 American lives. In the months after the attack, multiple investigations attempted to determine who was responsible. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter Short, the Army commander in Hawaii, were both relieved of command and forced into retirement. Their careers were destroyed, their reputations tarnished. For decades afterward, both men fought to clear their names, arguing that they had been denied critical intelligence that might have allowed them to prepare for the attack. They pointed to intercepted Japanese diplomatic messages that Washington had received but never shared with commanders in the field. They argued that they had been made scapegoats for failures that occurred at the highest levels of government. In 1999, more than 50 years after the attack, the United States Senate passed a resolution stating that both Kimmel and Short had performed their duties competently and professionally, and that the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the result of dereliction of duty. But by then, both men had been dead for decades. The vindication came too late to restore what they had lost. The memorial that now sits above the sunken hull of the USS Arizona receives more than 2 million visitors each year. They come to pay their respects to the 1,177 sailors and Marines who remain entombed within the ship, to drop flowers and leis into the water, to reflect on the meaning of sacrifice and remembrance. Oil still leaks from the Arizona's bunkers, more than 80 years after she sank. Park rangers call them the tears of the Arizona, black drops that rise to the surface and spread across the water, a daily reminder of what happened here. The names of the dead are inscribed on a marble wall inside the memorial. Young men and old officers and enlisted from every state in the nation. Some were teenagers who had lied about their age to join the Navy. Others were career sailors approaching retirement. All of them died on a Sunday morning that was supposed to be peaceful. Among the names is that of Thomas Augusta Free, a young sailor from Texas who was killed aboard the Arizona. His brother, William Free, had served on the same ship but had been transferred just weeks before the attack. William spent the rest of his life grappling with survivor's guilt, wondering why he had been spared when his brother had died. Also inscribed is the name of Father Aloysius Schmidt, a Catholic chaplain aboard the Oklahoma. When the ship capsized, Father Schmidt helped 12 men escape through a small porthole before the flooding became too severe. He could have escaped himself, but he pushed others through ahead of him. When the water rose too high, he was trapped inside. He was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal posthumously and became the first American chaplain to die in the Second World War. These stories, and thousands like them, are what give meaning to the memorial and to the memory of that day. But there is another monument at Pearl Harbor, smaller and less visited, that tells a different part of the story. At Upon Point, where Lockard and Elliott manned their radar station, a simple plaque marks the spot where the attack was first detected. It honors the two young men who did their job exactly right and tried to warn their country about the danger approaching. They could not have done more than they did. They were young and inexperienced in operating equipment that most people didn't understand. They made the call, they sounded the alarm, and they were told to forget it. The lesson of Opana Point is not about blame, but about attention. It reminds us that warnings often come from unexpected places, from people who might be easy to dismiss, from systems that are new and unfamiliar. It reminds us that the cost of ignoring those warnings can be unimaginably high. Joseph Lockard died in 1998, at the age of 78. He had lived a long and productive life, but he never stopped thinking about that December morning. In interviews late in his life, he spoke about the weight of watching something terrible approach, knowing it was real, and being unable to make anyone understand. "We saw it coming," he said. "We did everything we were supposed to do, and nobody believed us." George Eliot died in 2003 at the age of 84. Like Lockard, he spent decades reflecting on what might have been. Unlike many Pearl Harbor survivors, he and Lockard had not been wounded or traumatized by the attack itself. Their trauma was different, the trauma of knowledge, of warning, of being right when it was too late for being right to matter. The attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. It ended America's isolation and thrust the nation into a global war that would last nearly 4 years and cost over 400,000 American lives. It transformed the American military from a modest peacetime force into the most powerful fighting machine the world had ever seen. It established the United States as a global superpower, a role it has never relinquished. But it also left scars that have never fully healed. The men who survived that morning carried those memories for the rest of their lives. The families who lost loved ones never stopped grieving. And the nation itself was changed in ways that continue to shape our world today. 72 years after the attack, on December the 7th, 2013, Joseph Langdell became the oldest known survivor of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He had served aboard the USS Utah, a training ship that was struck by Japanese torpedoes early in the attack. He escaped the sinking ship by climbing through a porthole and swimming through burning oil to reach shore. Langdell returned to Pearl Harbor every year for the anniversary ceremony until he was physically unable to make the trip. He spent his final years speaking to students and community groups about what happened that day, trying to ensure that the lessons of Pearl Harbor would not be forgotten. "Remember us," he would say. "Remember what happened here. Make sure it never happens again." Other survivors carried their memories in different ways. Stratton brothers, Donald and Joe, were both aboard the Arizona that morning. Donald was badly burned but survived. Joe was among the dead. Donald spent the next 2 years in hospitals, undergoing multiple skin grafts and surgeries. He returned to duty in 1944 and served on the destroyer USS Stack for the remainder of the war. In his later years, Donald Stratton became an advocate for Pearl Harbor survivors and a tireless speaker about the importance of remembering the attack. He co-authored a book about his experiences and returned to Hawaii many times to pay his respects to his fallen shipmates. He died in February 2020 at the age of 97, one of the last living survivors from the Arizona. Another survivor, Herb Elfring, was a young sailor aboard the USS Maryland when the attack began. He manned an anti-aircraft gun throughout the assault, firing at Japanese planes until his ammunition was exhausted. He later served throughout the Pacific War, participating in some of the bloodiest battles of the conflict. In his 90s, Elfring still attended Pearl Harbor memorial ceremonies, determined to honor his fallen friends. "I made a promise to them," he said. "I promised I would never forget them, and I never will." The survivors of Pearl Harbor are almost all gone now. Only a handful remain, men in their late 90s and early hundreds who were teenagers or young men when the bombs fell. Soon there will be none left, and the attack will pass from living memory into history. But the lessons remain. Listen to the warnings, even when they come from unexpected places. Take seriously the threats that others dismiss. And never assume that peace will last forever, because history teaches us that it rarely does. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, 2 young men saw death coming on a radar screen. They tried to sound the alarm. They were told not to worry about it. And within 90 minutes, the world had changed forever. The captain who dismissed that radar blip was not evil. He was not stupid. He was a young officer trying to do his job with limited information and limited training. He made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and he was wrong. That is perhaps the most important lesson of all. Catastrophe rarely announces itself clearly. It comes wrapped in ambiguity, disguised by routine, easy to dismiss until it is too late. The difference between safety and disaster often depends on someone, somewhere, taking a warning seriously when everyone else wants to forget it. Joseph Lockhart knew this. He lived with it every day of his life, and in his later years, he hoped that telling his story might help prevent others from making the same mistake. "Maybe someday," he once said, "someone will hear a warning that doesn't make sense, that seems unlikely, that everyone else wants to ignore. And maybe they'll remember what happened at Pearl Harbor, and maybe they'll listen." It was 7:45 on a Sunday morning, and the radar screen showed death approaching at 200 miles per hour. A young private picked up the phone and tried to save his country, and on the other end of the line, someone laughed. Remember them. Remember what they saw. Remember what they tried to do. And when your turn comes to listen or to dismiss, when you receive the warning that doesn't quite fit, remember Opana Point. Remember Joseph Lockhart and George Eliot. Remember that they were right, and nobody believed them. The story of the radar operators has become a case study in military academies around the world. It is taught as an example of how organizational failures can override individual competence, how bureaucratic inertia can prevent even clear warnings from being acted upon, how the fog of routine can obscure the signs of approaching disaster. At the National Security Agency, new analysts are told the story of Opana Point during their training. They are reminded that the job of intelligence is not just to collect information, but to ensure that information reaches the people who can act on it. They are warned that even the best intelligence is worthless if it is ignored or misunderstood. The lesson resonates beyond the military. Business leaders, medical professionals, aviation safety experts, all have studied the Pearl Harbor disaster and drawn their own conclusions. In every field where early warning matters, where the stakes of ignoring a warning can be catastrophic, the story of December 7th serves as a cautionary tale. Because the price of ignoring a warning, the price of assuming everything will be fine, the price of forgetting about it, can be measured in ships burning on the water and names inscribed on marble walls and tears that still rise from the depths more than 80 years later. 2,403 of them, one for every American who died that morning, one for every life that might have been saved if someone had simply listened to what 2 young men were trying to tell them. The captain dismissed the radar blip. He laughed, and then he watched 4 battleships sink at Pearl Harbor. But you don't have to make the same mistake. When the warning comes, when the data doesn't fit, when something feels wrong, even if everyone around you says it's fine, remember this story. Remember what happened when a warning was ignored, and choose to listen. That is how we honor them. That is how we remember. That is how we make sure that December 7th, 1941 truly is a date that lives in infamy, not as a moment of failure, but as a lesson that changed the world. The radar blip was real. The attack was coming. And now you know what happens when we choose not to believe it. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And may we never have to learn this lesson again.